Well, I'm talking with Tony Kalume at Lewes Library, and we've just witnessed the first Lewes Black History Month, Tony.
This celebration for Black History, because it's celebrated all over Britain, and I used to go all the way to Brighton to celebrate this, but this is the first time in 5 years I've been in Lewes that I've seen anything like this. So this is our very first one, and we thank so much the library for letting us do it here.
And has it been a success?
Wow, I think it's bombed. It's so magical. There's so many people here, and it's been lovely seeing all the children and all the people around. Yeah.
Fantastic. But Black History Month itself has been going since the 80s, isn't it? It's got a long established history.
Yeah, it has got a long history all over UK, but it's been quite suppressed in Lewes, because most black minority ethnic people in Lewes didn't know that they could actually come together and do it in Lewes without going to Brighton or London, because it's very big in Brighton and London, but in Lewes there was never anything like this.
And will this happen again next year?
That's what we are hoping for. We want to sit down and start organizing for the next event and make it bigger and better than it was today.
That's fantastic. And if there's anything we can do at Radio Lewes, we'll be more than happy to help.
Yeah, we want all the support, and anybody is welcome. Everybody is welcome. Don't think that it's black just because you have to be black to come there. No, everybody and anybody who feels like they need to come in and talk and network and cohesion with other cultures, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony, and well done. It was a very exciting and interesting day, and there'll be some clips up on YouTube a bit later on when I get a few spare 5 minutes to do some editing. Cheers, man.
Thank you very much. You're right. Bye. Thank you.
Because I was told I was an innocent bystander, actually. But, right, I shall do a short poem and a short story to go with it. My father's from a place in what is now northeast Uganda called Lewes. It's a region about the size of a county, but in the old days, Lewes was an area where there was a lot of fighting. All the men were warriors because the environment was very hostile. They had to defend themselves, defend their country, and keep their boundaries. And my dad used to tell a story, and he used to say of the Langi, we were never slaves. We always fought hard and brave. We defeated all enemies. We repulsed all armies. We had no need of king or chief. Every man had his own song to sing. And basically this story is about a book that I read, and it was by Sir Samuel White Baker, who was also called Pasha Baker. And a lot of you have been in history lessons, you probably remember him. He was an explorer that came down the River Nile from the Mediterranean through Egypt, what is now Sudan, and into the north part of Uganda. And his business was apparently to stop the slave trade, but also he was there to secure British interests and try and find resources that Britain could exploit. And he told a story in his book, which I only read about a year ago, of being on the west side of the Nile, which is now what's called a trolley land, with a detachment of Egyptian soldiers, but they weren't actually Egyptians, they were a mishmash of a lot of different people, and who were actually not there doing Egyptian government business, but they were there to slavery. And he recounted an incident where he stood on the west side of the Nile and watched a detachment of heavily armed soldiers going over to the east side of the Nile, which is the region that my dad comes from, with the intention of raiding for slaves. And he also said sometime later he watched the aftermath of this group of soldiers who came back killed, decimated, massacred, completely obliterated. And he said that what happened was the Langi, my father's people, had word of this raid and they were waiting for them. And as they went across into the Langi country, they sent a group of soldiers, about 250 heavily armed men, who were ambushed, totally killed, and then the reserve force was attacked and they made it back just by the skin of their teeth. They lost a lot of weapons, which the Langi, of course, captured and used to their own benefit. And I was really so taken by that story, because that's the story that my dad used to tell me, and it's a story that passed down from his great-grandfather, who was a war leader at that time and would have been involved in that battle. And it just struck me that those two men, Sir Samuel Baker, an English explorer on one side of the River Nile, and my great-great-grandfather on the other side, and they didn't know each other. But some 80 years later, the great-great-grandson of that warrior came to Brighton as an engineering student, and that was my father. And that is my story of my father, from warrior to civil engineer. Thank you.
Wow, history in the making, living history. We call it living history, colonialism, independence, and all that. Well, now, next we've got, I know she will hate me, we got Nimi Mash, story. We got a story.
I will use the microphone, and I'm going to tell you a story called The Blind Man and the Hunter. How does a good story start? Children, could you help me here? Once upon a time, there was a blind man, and he lived with his sister in a village, in a hut, and the village was on the edge of a forest. Now this blind man, he was very clever. Even though his eyes could see nothing, he seemed to know more about the world than people whose eyes were as sharp as needles. He would sit outside his hut and he would talk to the passers-by, and they would ask him questions. If they had a problem, they would ask him, and he would always give them good advice. If they wanted to know something, again, they would ask him, and his answers would always be the right ones. And people would shake their heads and say, blind man, how is it that you are so wise? And he would just smile and say, because I see with my ears. Now, this blind man's sister, one day, she fell in love. She fell in love with a hunter from another village. And sure enough, eventually, they got married. And after the great wedding feast, the hunter, he came back to the village to live with his new wife and her brother in the hut. But this hunter, he had no time for the blind man. He had no time for his sister's brother at all. He said, a man with no eyes, what use is he? And his new wife, she said, but husband, he knows more than people who can see everything. He is very wise. This made the hunter laugh. A man who lives in darkness, what can he know? Every day, the hunter would go out of the village into the forest with his traps and his arrows and his knives. And he would go into the forest to go hunting. And every day when he came back in the evening, the blind man would say to him, please, tomorrow, take me out hunting with you. I want to come into the forest. And every evening, the hunter would shake his head and say, what use is a blind man? And so, the days and the weeks and the months passed, and every night, when the blind hunter returned home, the blind man would say, please, tomorrow, take me with you. And every evening, the hunter would shake his head. And then one day, the hunter was feeling pretty good. He had come home with a fine catch, a fat gazelle. And when his wife had prepared and cooked the meat, and he was sat with a big, full belly, he felt good, and he turned to the blind man and he said, you know, tomorrow you can come hunting with me. So in the morning, they set off with the traps and the spears and the arrows into the forest, with the hunter leading the blind man by the hand. And they're walking along, and walking for hours and hours through the trees. And suddenly, the blind man, he tugs the hand of the hunter, and he says, "Shh, there is a lion." The hunter looks around, he can see nothing. And he says, "Where?" And the blind man says, "Shh, there is a lion, but it's all right. He has eaten. He won't hurt us." And so they carry on along the track. And sure enough, they come across this big, fat lion lying underneath the tree, relaxing after a good meal. So they carry on a bit further, and then the hunter turns round to the blind man and he says, How did you know about the lion?" And the blind man, he just smiles and he says, "Because I see with my ears." And so they carry on along the track for hours and hours. And then again, the blind man takes the hunter's hand and he tugs his hand and he says, "Shh, there is an elephant." The hunter looks around, he can see nothing. And they carry on, and sure enough, they see an elephant. He's in a waterhole, and he is spatting himself on the back with mud. They carry on, and then the hunter turns to the blind man and he says, How did you know about the elephant?" And sure enough, the blind man again, he says, "Because I see with my ears." And so they carry on and they come to a clearing. And in the clearing, the hunter sees that this is the place for him to set the traps. He says to the blind man, "You sit down, I will set some traps." So he sets one trap and he shows the blind man how to set another. And when the traps are set, they walk the long journey back to their village. And the hunter says, "In the morning, we will come back and we will check our traps." So sure enough, the next morning they wake up really early and they start on their walk. The hunter offers his hand to the blind man. And the blind man says, "No, it's okay, I know the way now." And so the blind man leads the way. And he does not trip on a single root or tree stump. And he does not miss a single turning, until, sure enough, eventually they come to the clearing where they have set the traps. And as soon as they enter the clearing, the hunter can see that they have each caught a bird in their trap. And straight away, he can see that the bird in his trap is a little grey one. And the bird in the blind man's trap is a splendid beauty of a bird with crimson and red and gold feathers. And he says to the blind man, "Sit down, we have each caught a bird." And as he is walking across to the traps, he is thinking to himself, "A blind man, how will he know the difference?" And so, what does he do? He gives the little grey bird to the blind man, and he keeps the beautiful crimson, red and gold bird for himself. And so, they gather up their things and they start walking back to the village. And on the way, the hunter says to the blind man, "Hey, if you are so clever, then tell me this. Why is there so much greed and anger, hunger and pain in the world?" And the blind man says, "Because the world is full of people just like you who take what is not theirs." And the hunter feels very, very deep shame. And so he gives the blind man the gold and crimson and green bird, and he takes the grey bird back for himself. And they carry on their journey back to their village. And as they're walking, again, the hunter says to the blind man, "Well, if you are so clever, then tell me this. Why is there so much kindness, gentleness, and love in this world?" And the blind man says, "Because the world is full of people just like you, who learn from their mistakes." And so they carry on back to the village. And from that day forward, if the hunter ever heard someone say, "Hey, blind man, how is it you are so wise?" he would put his arm around his brother-in-law and he would say, "Because he sees with his ears and he hears with his heart." Thank you.